The televised countdown, the roar of engines, a majestic, fiery blast. The sequence of a space shuttle launch is a sight quite unlike anything else in this world. It encompasses, in many ways, the ingenuity and perseverance of humans to push past boundaries and explore deeper into the unknown. The first time this kind of flight took place was 40 years ago on April 12, 1981 at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida with the Space Shuttle Columbia and a crew of 2 astronauts.
The launch itself of Columbia in 1981 was a truly exciting experience. Spaceflight had sort of become passé over time. People were excited by the moon landings, but the flights that took place in the 1970s were of less significance to most people, and no American astronaut, anyway, had been into space since 1975. So there's now a new excitement that starts to emerge in the spring of '81 as people prepare for this space shuttle launch. And it was a truly remarkable experience.
That's Roger Launius, a space historian and former chief historian of NASA. Launius says the space shuttle was so intriguing back in the day because it could take off like a rocket and land back on Earth like a plane. It was also the first partially reusable spacecraft, with the engines, hull, and control systems all being built to last.
The space shuttle was an unusual-looking vehicle for what had gone before. Previously, there had been a rocket with a capsule on top, the Mercury capsule, the Gemini capsule, or the Apollo capsule. This looked very much like an airplane, and that was the intention. It was to launch attached to the side of a large launch rocket, but itself would go into space from there and then come back and land like an airplane. And one astronaut told me, he says, you have to remember that you're sitting on top of a small nuclear weapon. At least that's how much power is in the space shuttle if it were to blow up. And, of course, one did in 1986 with tragic, horrible consequences. But most of the time, virtually all the time, it's under human control, and the astronauts flew 135 times into space on space shuttles during a 30-year period.
Over these many missions, the Space Shuttle fleet spearheaded some of the biggest milestones in NASA and space history. This includes the launch of the Hubble Space Telescope in 1990 and several flights and spacewalks to help build and service the International Space Station, which has been in operation since 2001. Launius says that another early aim of the program was to offer a safe and reliable way to fly civilians to space. However, among the many successes were also some big failures.
We had unique flights in which members of Congress were flown. And by 1985, the shuttle is looking to be a routine space access vehicle, which was its intention. That's what it was supposed to do. And quite frankly, people became complacent. On the 25th flight, the launch of Challenger in January of 1986, in which it takes off, and 73 seconds into the flight, it's heading off into space, and we see this enormous explosion. And the crew is lost. The vehicle is lost. I mean, it's a tragic of immense proportions.
In 1967, 3 astronauts were killed in a flash fire during a ground testing in preparation for the first Apollo mission. Up until Challenger, NASA had never lost astronauts during an in-space flight.
It was devastating. The people at NASA believed that they had a vehicle that they could count on. They thought it was a more routine activity than it actually turned out to be. You realized after the fact that the space shuttle was, and always would be, really an experimental vehicle, one in which you had to be very cautious to ensure that it could fly successfully.
Launius notes that after the Challenger disaster, the fleet was grounded for more than 2 years until 1988. When it returned, many Americans were excited and rallied together to support the relaunch of the Space Shuttle program. For more than a decade, a large number of missions took place without issue. However, this came to an abrupt halt in 2003 when the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated as it re-entered Earth's atmosphere, killing all 7 crew members on board. After this second disaster, support started to quickly dwindle.
There were a lot of people who thought, maybe it's time to move on. NASA had been trying to move on for a number of years. They had plans in the works, frustrated plans as they turned out to be, to build a replacement vehicle for the Space Shuttle. And several of the programs that had been undertaken had gotten to a point where they were too expensive or the technical challenges were too great, and they had to sort of stop that program, retrench, and start over. And that had happened over and over again. But after the loss of Columbia, it became obvious that we needed to do something different. And almost a year later, in January of 2004, President George W. Bush announced that the shuttle would retire. He set a date of 2010. That was extended by a year to finish the work necessary to complete the International Space Station.
In July 2011, the Space Shuttle Atlantis landed at the Kennedy Space Center, marking the final flight of the program. Today, almost a decade later, the landscape of space travel is very much alive. More private entities like SpaceX have entered the space travel arena and are partnering with NASA to head into orbit.
Most famously, SpaceX's Falcon 9 and Dragon capsule has been carrying cargo to the space station for several years, and last year began flying astronauts to the station.
Launius predicts that the next milestones in space travel will focus on the moon and other missions like those to Mars and beyond.
Ultimately, I would like to think in the next decade or so, some sort of a base on the moon probably will look a lot like Antarctica, dedicated for scientific purposes, people cycling in and out on a regular basis. And that's sort of the fulfillment of NASA's vision of exploration in my mind.
Also, as more private entities enter the industry, Launius says civilian space travel is back on the table as a very real possibility. But don't pack your bags quite yet. It's still an extremely hefty price tag.
There have already been tourists in space. Some have paid to fly on Soyuz capsules into Earth orbit to go to the space station for a period of time. Dennis Tito was the first of those space tourists to fly, but several others have done so since that time. We're going to see more of that as the future unfolds.
While future endeavors show promise, the past shows the brilliance of humans who dreamt big and dove headfirst into the unknown. From 1981 to 2011, the Space Shuttle program was a pioneer in space. Despite some tragedies along the way, it paved a path and created an infrastructure that humans rely on every day. Across these many missions, thousands of satellites entered orbit, and astronauts maneuvered through difficult tasks and spacewalks in an effort to build a home away from home.
One of the really significant things that came out of the Space Shuttle program was that it made Earth orbital activities routine. Before this time, with Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, with the Russian capsules that they were flying, it was truly an adventure. It was a frontier, if you will, and you didn't know quite what to expect. But the shuttle, with 30 years of experience, made space orbital activities pretty much routine. We could go up, we could rendezvous, we could dock with things, we could perform spacewalks, we could retrieve satellites, we could deploy satellites, we could do all kinds of things in orbit, and we understood what was taking place there, and it's no longer a frontier. It's now been incorporated into the normal realm of human experience. The shuttle did that.
To find out more about the U.S. Space Shuttle program, check out Roger Launius's new book, NASA's Space Shuttle 40th Anniversary. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.
Viewpoints returns in just a moment. A third of Americans think we will all be eating meat-free diets in the future, and the future is closer than you think. A recent survey of 2,000 Americans conducted by OnePoll reveals the average person thinks we'll all be meat-free by 2039. That's just 18 years away. Of the 52% surveyed who don't think that going plant-based is realistic right now, 1 in 5 worries that it's too expensive. But Vegan Strong National Tour Director and multi-sport athlete Robert Cheek says think again.
Plant-based eating can be incredibly affordable if you focus on eating fruits, vegetables, beans, rice, nuts, and seeds. Going vegan is better for your health, your wallet, and the earth.
During the pandemic, more than half of people have even made a game of cooking at home, and more people than ever have found themselves trying new foods they never thought they would. For more information, check out veganstrong.com. That's veganstrong.com.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints. Coming up next week.
Change is what is wild about nature, and we should cherish that and look out for some of these incoming species, the go-getter colonists.
A different perspective on invasive species. Then,
I very often watch students speak and they lose control of their breath. And there's a difference between speaking from your diaphragm and speaking from your chest. And when you speak from your chest, you lose control of the force of your voice.
How do you feel about public speaking? I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.